Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Dr. Heliana Ramirez. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm presenting to you today from land that has historically and continues to be cared for by the Miwok, the Bay Miwok folks in California. It is an honor to be here with you all. We are survivors, and I am getting chills throughout this day as I hear people's stories, and I want to just acknowledge that we don't want to ignore the sensations in our bodies. Sometimes moving can help to release some of the traumatic energy that can bubble up while we hear intense discussions that relate to our own experiences. I'm a licensed social worker who specializes in trauma therapy. I'm a researcher of racial, gender, and LGBTQ-related workplace trauma, and I provide expert witness testimony in workplace trauma cases. Today, I will be speaking about a study I conducted on the health impacts of workplace abuse on pregnant employees and their babies, specifically focusing on the findings related to mobbing. This study was first published in the book Corporate Blues, The Untold Story of Women in Toxic Workspaces, edited in 2026 by Dr. Carrie Yazid. And I would like to give you an activation or trigger warning that I will be discussing suicide, miscarriages, and stillbirth. Please do care for yourself as we go through this presentation. So I'm going to share my slides. This is the moment, folks, where I tell people I'm a better social worker than I am techie. And I appreciate you holding on with me as I get to the slideshow part of this. And you can see my notes. My goodness, I feel somewhat exposed by that. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to be going over a definition of mobbing, the study design, participants, the findings, and if there's time for Q&A. So I use the definition of mobbing that Duffy and Sperry presented in 2014 Overcoming Mobbing book, really looking at mobbing as a group act. We're not talking about an individual bully. We're talking about a group of people who weaponize the institutional power, oftentimes of HR, to force a person out or prevent them from being promoted when that is due to them. What I found in interviewing workplace abuse survivors who were pregnant in abusive workplaces was that the mechanisms and risk of mobbing are quite different when a person is pregnant or postpartum. And I'm going to move this along. So part of what I think was contributing to the findings, which I'll share with you in a moment, is matrescence. So matrescence is a time of profound physical, psychological, and emotional social identity transformation into motherhood. So this is from the moment of conception to typically about a year after birth, when the entire body, the identity changes. Matrescence marks a major biosocial life event, including rewiring of the maternal brain network, major changes from hormones to loosening of ligaments, and organs being displaced to make room for a growing womb. We see sleep disruption, changes to caloric need, home environment, and social relationships from workplaces to society at large. When psychological abuse is tied to one's livelihood during this fragile time, pregnant workers and fetuses are more vulnerable to injury than non-pregnant workers. While research on the babies of pregnant women in abusive workplaces is in its infancy, all pun intended, research on pregnant women experiencing depression is growing rapidly. While many factors influence fetal growth and brain development, a growing body of research finds associations between prenatal depression prior to and during pregnancy with numerous physical and mental health problems among babies, including learning, behavioral, and mood difficulties. Beginning with brain structure, maternal depression during pregnancy is associated with changes to baby's gray matter, with a thinner cerebral cortex as seen on brain scans at the ages of 6 to 9 years old, which may presage later problems such as depression, anxiety, impaired cortisol control, and attention difficulties in the child. Hormonal changes are also noted in babies born to depressed mothers, as their fetuses have higher cortisol levels and lower levels of dopamine and serotonin, two neurotransmitters associated with depression. Exposure to stress while in the womb is further associated with illnesses years later as adults, from mental health disorders to hypertension, heart disease to diabetes, immune dysfunction to inflammation, and poor glucose metabolism to hormonal imbalances, as well as reduced immune system functioning through shorter telomere, that is the chromosomal marker of health and aging, telomere length, and increased allergies and intestinal problems due to changes in gut microbial flora. So when we look at the literature, what we're seeing is that for babies who are in utero when the mother has depression, we're seeing that there are issues with pregnancy and birth, from miscarriages, stillbirth, and preterm to low birth weight. We also see injuries to the baby, both physiological and mental health injuries. So in this study, I sampled, there were 18 study subjects. On purpose, I oversampled Black, Indigenous, and other women of color, who I refer to as the global majority, because in part of the presentation, the very powerful presentation that we just heard, the higher risk of being targeted for being an ethnic or racial minority in the workplace. So in this study sample, I interviewed 3 Black American women, 1 Afro-Indo-Caribbean woman in the United Kingdom, 1 Nigerian woman in the United States, 3 Latinas in the United States, 1 Puerto Rican Afro-Latina, 1 Chicana who is Mexican and indigenous ancestry, 1 Ecuadorian woman, 1 Métis indigenous woman in Canada, and 1 Indian woman in the United Kingdom. I also interviewed 3 Caucasian women who identify as white. 7 Caucasian women who identify as white, 3 British white women, 4 white American women, of whom 1 identifies as Iranian. There was quite a bit of diversity in the industries and job duties. My respondents came from the industries of pharmaceuticals, law, school-based social work, small business, advertising, professional sports, construction, public health, banking, education, mental health, safety, education, and behavioral health research. And their job titles included director, manager, head of diversity and inclusion, dean, clinician, salesperson, attorney, senior researcher, state health director for the Ministry of Health, program officer, grants manager, and IT manager. Chillingly, scientists and doctors assert in the documentary film In Utero that the nature versus nurture question is misguided, as human genetic expression nature is activated in relation to the environment. Our first environment is the mother's womb, where slight changes to hormones, amniotic fluid, and even the mother's mood can trigger major changes to fetal development, where every second, 50,000 neurons are formed in the fetus's developing brain. Most of the 18 women interviewed in this study could not definitively state that work stress caused problems in their pregnancies. However, all women wondered how their work-related stress might have impacted them and their babies. There was one exception to this. A woman who gave birth to who had a stillbirth. She had amniotic rupture where she was leaking amniotic fluid and was taken to the hospital. And several days later, the baby died in her womb. The autopsy revealed that there was no indication of an infection. There was no bacterial or viral infection. And the autopsy literally states that the thought is that the baby died due to stress reaction from the mother. The woman herself identified the major stressor in her life as a workplace mobbing. In this study, women had reported several fertility and pregnancy problems. As I just mentioned, there was the stillbirth. 3 women reported miscarriages. 4 women had premature births. There were 2 emergency cesarean sections, one at 25 weeks, one at 41 weeks. 2 women had severe preeclampsia. 2 women had problems with amniotic fluid, the woman I just mentioned, but there was also another woman who had too much fluid. There was placenta previa, placenta covering the cervix, severe contractions requiring emergency medical care, not Braxton Hicks, and it was several months prior to when the baby was supposed to be born. There was a knot in an umbilical cord, and there was sepsis following birth. This required rehospitalization 10 days after having given birth and being discharged home. There was another woman who was hospitalized for extreme exhaustion 8 months postpartum, which contributed to a dissolution of her small business, which she had created while she was being mobbed as a way to create an exit strategy from the mobbing workplace. The other thing that I want to mention here is the psychiatric hospitalizations, which were significantly higher in my study population as compared to the general literature, and I'll share that in just a moment. But looking at the baby health, we saw 22% of the respondents in this study ended up in the NICU, and this is compared to 9 to 15% in the general literature. We saw multiple babies who were hospitalized after having gone home. One ended up back in the hospital for a cancer treatment, and another baby had an RSV infection. There were significant developmental delays, as well as immune system, neurological, and emotional problems, ranging from jaundice, hemangioma, breathing problems. One baby was born at 1% of the growth chart. We had severe immune system disorders among 2 babies, and 4 babies ended up being identified as having emotional challenges, including ADHD and depression. One of the babies made it to high school, and a couple of years ago died by suicide. The findings for mother's health was significant. 15% of the women in the study ended up being hospitalized in psychiatric hospitals or in intensive outpatient mental health treatment. This is compared to 0.04% of mothers in the general population who have no prior psychiatric hospitalization. And of the mothers in the general population who had a prior psychiatric hospitalization before giving birth, only 9.24% of them ended up in the hospital. I did not ask the women that I interviewed whether or not they had had prior psychiatric hospitalization, but regardless of which, that number is extremely high. And I suspect that part of what's happening here is that the moral injury that we experience as targets of mobbing is amplified to an extreme degree when a person is pregnant or postpartum because of that matrescence, that rewiring of the neural networks that makes us extremely attuned to issues of safety and danger. Okay, so I'm going to shake this off a minute. If you're feeling some intense energy, some adrenaline or cortisol, right there with you, we are normal. That is the healthy part of us that reacts to danger. That should not be pathologized. I appreciate whomever shared that earlier. I refer to these as mental injuries, not mental illnesses. When we are hit, we end up with a bruise. When we are psychologically manipulated, we end up with mental injury. So, getting into some of what I found that was unique to pregnant women and women who were postpartum. I saw that there were desired job duties that were removed from women when they went on maternity leave or when they would take time off of work to attend prenatal appointments. There was an increased risk that a mob would come in and either put more work on their plates that was completely untenable or remove work from their plates. I also saw extreme work hours, which is more damaging for a person who is growing a life. To work from 7 a.m. to 10 to 12 p.m. at night, it just drains the body's energy, which is required to be growing 50 billion, I believe it was, brain cells per minute. So we had a lack of respect for maternity leave. Okay, thank you. I will fly through here then. We saw numerous privacy violations. Some of the most egregious were a person who went onto Facebook and found a worker's mother's Facebook that announced her daughter's pregnancy. That person in a mob brought the information back to the workplace, and that woman was fired summarily at 4 months pregnant. And so there were also stories of women who would say that workplace mobbing would involve people coming to their stomach and touching their body. These were people that they already had a sense were not safe to be around. And those people were using the pregnancy as an excuse to come into the person's physical space. There were many women who were forced to nurse and or pump milk in unsanitary conditions like bathrooms. There were storage lockers, and some women were forced to pump or nurse in their cars. Part of what I think is very, very unique about mobbing against pregnant and postpartum women has to do with jealousy. When a woman forgoes pregnancy so that she can climb a corporate ladder or whatever is in her industry and ends up passing the point at which she can have a child, and then hires a woman who has it all, who is moving up in the career ladder and is also pregnant, I think that's part of what was fueling a particularly vicious kind of cruelty and mobbing led by other women against the pregnant and postpartum woman. Verbal and physical assault. Horrifyingly, I interviewed one woman who was a safety officer within a construction company, and she was visibly pregnant. She ended up on a work site doing her safety monitoring, and there was a construction worker who began throwing tools at her, hammers and wrenches in her direction. Obviously, being physically assaulted is horrifying for anyone, but when a person is pregnant, you risk loss of the baby. And then the group dynamics we saw being dismissed and invalidated by colleagues and supervisors. Even the mobbing would go into the situation where women felt like they couldn't go to their prenatal appointments for fear that they would be demoted or forced out of their job. One woman described being in the middle of an OBGYN appointment. Her doctor's hands were literally inside of her body while she was taking a client call, because she was terrified that she would lose her job. If you're pregnant and you lose access to your health insurance, it is a terrifying experience. What are you going to do if you have to go in and give birth in a hospital? There was one woman who was fired, and she called her loan officer for her student loans and was asking for forbearance and was upset on the phone. That loan officer called police thinking that she was in suicidal crisis. Police showed up at her house, took her in handcuffs while pregnant to the hospital. And that's where she was forced to sign a non-disclosure agreement in order to maintain her health insurance so that she could deliver in the hospital. The last thing that I'll share here is that the mobbing that I noticed bled outside of the workplace. I saw multiple women where the mobbing continued into the family and into other parts of their lives. So one woman who miscarried, the in-laws then mobbed her out of the family, saying that it was her fault that she miscarried the baby. I welcome you to contact me if you have any questions, and thank you so much for being here and for everything that you have survived.